What would you do if 6 armed gangsters walked into your restaurant and threatened to take everything you'd built? Most men would reach for a weapon. Most men would start a war. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. October 1948, a cold autumn night in Harlem. Sal the Butcher Bonanno storms into Bumpy's establishment with 6 soldiers, all packing heat. He delivers an ultimatum that would make any man's blood boil. Then he says the one word you never say to the godfather of Harlem. Everyone expected an explosion, a bloodbath, bodies hitting the floor. Instead, Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile a man gives you when he's already planned your funeral and you haven't even realized you're dead yet. What happened next would shake the foundations of organized crime in New York City forever. This is the true story of how one man's intelligence, reputation, and unshakable respect from his community defeated the most powerful crime families in America without firing a single shot.
Before we get into that fateful night, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1948. This wasn't the Harlem you see romanticized in movies. This was a kingdom carved out of concrete and survival, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was its undisputed king. But Bumpy didn't rule from some secret underground bunker or fortress-like mansion. He ruled from Wells Restaurant on 135th Street, a modest place with red leather booths, checkered tablecloths, and the constant aroma of fried chicken and collard greens, filling the air like a sweet, savory incense. To outsiders, it looked like just another soul food joint, but to anyone who mattered in Harlem, Wells Restaurant was sacred ground. It was Switzerland, neutral territory where beefs were checked at the door, and Bumpy's peace was absolute law. Musicians came through those doors. Preachers, numbers runners, politicians, even corrupt cops who were supposed to be arresting these same people would sit down for a plate and a conversation. Why? Because Wells Restaurant represented something bigger than food. It represented order in a neighborhood the rest of New York had abandoned. And Bumpy Johnson, he was the architect of that order. See, Bumpy controlled something everyone wanted, Harlem's numbers racket. And if you don't know what the numbers game was, let me break it down for you. The numbers game was beautifully simple. People bet small amounts, sometimes just pennies or nickels, on 3-digit numbers. If your number hit based on that day's calculation, you won. If it didn't, the house kept your money. But here's what made it different from everything else in that era. It gave hope to people who had nothing else. In 1948, Harlem was suffocating under systemic racism, poverty, and limited opportunities. A factory worker making $20 a week couldn't dream of saving enough for a better life, but if his number hit, that could mean $200 in his pocket, enough to buy his daughter a new winter coat, enough to pay 3 months' rent in advance, enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, the universe didn't have it out for him. The numbers game wasn't just gambling to the people of Harlem, it was dignity, it was possibility, it was defiance against a system designed to keep them down. Now, Bumpy didn't invent the numbers game. That credit goes to a brilliant, fearless woman named Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen. She built Harlem's numbers operation in the 1920s and early 1930s with nothing but intelligence and audacity. But then, Dutch Schultz and the Italian mob caught wind of how much money was flowing through Harlem. They wanted in. And by wanted in, I mean they tried to violently take over, threatening and terrorizing Madam Queen's operation until she had no choice but to seek protection. That's when she went to Bumpy Johnson in 1932. "Protect my operation," she told him, "and I'll make you the most powerful man in Harlem." Bumpy kept his word. By 1935, Dutch Schultz was dead, shot down in a New Jersey tavern, and by 1948, Bumpy Johnson controlled the entire numbers operation in Harlem. We're talking millions of dollars flowing through his hands every single year. And the Italian crime families, they were furious. See, in the world of 1940s organized crime, there was an unspoken rule. Black men didn't run empires, they worked for them. They were muscle, enforcers, street-level dealers, but never bosses. never equals. Bumpy Johnson shattered that rule, and the five families couldn't stand it. Frank Costello, arguably the most powerful mobster in New York, tried the diplomatic approach. He sent emissaries to negotiate. "Let's work together, Bumpy. We'll give you a percentage." Bumpy refused. Harlem wasn't for sale. Vito Genovese, more aggressive and hot-headed, sent threats. Messages delivered by intimidating men with cold eyes. "Step aside or we'll make you step aside." Bumpy ignored them, not out of arrogance, but because he understood something they didn't. You can't threaten a man who's already survived everything the world could throw at him. Bumpy Johnson had been shot, stabbed, and imprisoned multiple times. He'd survived the streets of Harlem when they were even more dangerous. Threats were just words, and words didn't move him. But Joe Bonanno was different. Joe was old school, traditional, and deeply offended that a black man had the audacity to tell Italian mobsters no. So Joe did what powerful men do when diplomacy fails. He sent someone to handle the problem with force. He sent his nephew, Sal the Butcher Bonanno. Sal had earned his nickname in the most horrific way possible. A guy in Brooklyn tried to skim money from a Bonanno card game. They say Sal took his time with that guy, made an example of him. They found pieces of him in 4 different boroughs. The message was clear: cross the Bonanno family, and you don't just die, you suffer first. Sal was 6'2", 230 pounds of muscle wrapped in expensive tailored suits. He was feared from Brooklyn to the Bronx, and he was being sent to put Bumpy Johnson in his place. This brings us to that night, October 12th, 1948.
8:47 p.m. Wells' restaurant was packed. Maybe 40 people, maybe more. It was a Tuesday night, but that didn't matter. Wells was always busy because it was more than a restaurant. It was a community center, a safe haven, a place where Harlem came to feel human. The jukebox was playing Dizzy Gillespie's Manteca, that Afro-Cuban jazz fusion that made you want to move even when you were sitting still. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling in lazy spirals. The sound of laughter, conversation, and clinking silverware created a symphony of normalcy. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual corner booth, positioned so he could see both doors, the kitchen entrance, and most of the restaurant. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival instinct, honed over decades. Across from him sat his wife, Mamie Johnson. If Bumpy was the king of Harlem, Mamie was its queen. Elegant, poised, educated, she carried herself with a dignity that could silence a room. She wasn't arm candy. She was a partner, an advisor, and someone Bumpy respected more than anyone alive. Bumpy was eating a ribeye steak, medium rare, cut with surgical precision. Everything Bumpy did was methodical, controlled. No wasted motion, no unnecessary energy. Every action had purpose. That's when the door opened. Sal Bonanno walked in first. Even in a crowded room, you couldn't miss him. 6'2", broad shoulders, expensive suit that probably cost more than most people in Harlem made in 6 months. Behind him came 6 men, all of them with the telltale bulges under their jackets that screamed armed and dangerous. They didn't try to hide the weapons. That was the point. This was a message. The restaurant noticed immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the jukebox seemed to get quieter, like the music itself recognized the threat that had just walked through the door. Sal walked straight to Bumpy's table, didn't ask permission, didn't wait to be invited, just walked right up and stood there, looking down at Bumpy like he was inspecting something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "Bumpy Johnson," Sal said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to talk." Bumpy didn't look up. He just kept cutting his steak with that same slow, precise motion. The knife made a soft, scraping sound against the porcelain plate. Each cut was deliberate, controlled. "I'm eating," Bumpy said quietly. Sal smiled, not a friendly smile, the kind of smile that says, "I'm about to enjoy what comes next." "Yeah, I can see that," Sal said, his voice dripping with condescension.
Nice restaurant you got here. Real quaint, real modest. He paused, looking around with exaggerated interest. But here's the thing, Bumpy. My Uncle Joe, he's got a problem. See, he thinks it's time for Harlem to get with the program, join the modern world. The numbers game, that's Italian business now. Always should have been. Bumpy still didn't look up, but Mamie did. She stared at Sal with the kind of cold contempt that could drop the temperature in a room by 20 degrees. Sal continued, his confidence growing with each word. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to step aside, hand over your operation to people who know how to run it properly. We'll give you a taste, 10% for your trouble. You can keep your little restaurant here, play the big man for your people, but the real money, that stays with us, where it belongs. The entire restaurant was holding its breath. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It was like watching a cobra and a mongoose circle each other, everyone waiting to see who would strike first. Bumpy set down his knife slowly. He picked up his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth with the same precision he applied to everything else. Then, for the first time since Sal entered, Bumpy looked up. His eyes were calm, too calm, the kind of calm that makes your survival instincts scream. "That's a generous offer," Bumpy said evenly, his voice barely above conversational volume. "But I'm gonna have to decline." Sal's smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake," Sal said, and now there was an edge to his voice. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. This ain't one of them." That's when Sal said it. The word, the slur, the one thing you never, ever say to a black man in his own establishment, in front of his wife, in front of his people. The fork Mamie was holding hit her plate with a sharp clink. In the suffocating silence of the restaurant, it sounded like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Not the kind of freeze where you're waiting to see what happens next, the kind of freeze where you're trying to decide if you're going to survive the next 5 minutes. Bumpy's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't show anger, didn't show anything. But everyone in that restaurant who knew him, everyone who understood what Bumpy Johnson was truly capable of, felt their blood turn to ice. Because Bumpy Johnson, sitting perfectly still, was more dangerous than most men in motion. His right hand moved slowly, deliberately. He reached into his vest pocket. Sal's 6 bodyguards all tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, ready to draw and fire. But Bumpy didn't pull a gun. He pulled out his razor. The same straight razor he'd carried since he was 16 years old, the same razor that had carved his reputation into the flesh of men who'd underestimated him, the same razor that had its own legend in the streets of Harlem. He placed it on the table gently, right next to his steak knife. The gesture was almost delicate, respectful even, like he was placing a sacred object on an altar. "You brought 6 men," Bumpy said quietly. His voice was so calm, it was terrifying. 6 guns into my restaurant, and you think that makes you dangerous? Sal tried to laugh it off, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "I think it makes me smart." "No," Bumpy said, "it makes you ignorant." He stood up slowly, folded his napkin with the same precision he'd used to cut his steak, placed it on the table. Every movement was controlled, purposeful, like a master chess player executing a strategy he'd planned out 50 moves in advance. The 6 bodyguards all reached for their weapons. Bumpy didn't even glance at them. "You see these people?" Bumpy said, gesturing to the 40 people in the restaurant. "You think they're just customers, just innocent folks eating dinner?" Sal looked around. For the first time, real uncertainty crept into his face. "Let me educate you, Sal," Bumpy said, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lesson. "That man by the door, his name is Thomas. I paid his daughter's hospital bills when she got pneumonia last winter, saved her life. That woman in the red dress, her husband used to beat her. I made sure he stopped, permanently. That kid washing dishes in the back, I kept him out of jail when the cops tried to frame him for something he didn't do." Bumpy took a step closer. Sal's bodyguards raised their weapons halfway, but Bumpy didn't stop.
"Every single person in this restaurant owes me something," Bumpy continued. "Not because I demanded it, not because I threatened them or extorted them or put fear into them, because I earned it. I helped them when nobody else would. I protected them when the world told them they didn't matter. I gave them dignity when society said they deserved none." He took another step. "You brought 6 guns into my house, Sal, but I've got 40 soldiers. They're just not wearing suits." Sal swallowed hard. He glanced around the room again, and this time he really saw what he was looking at. The faces staring back at him weren't afraid. They weren't intimidated by the guns or the threats or the Bonanno name. They were waiting for Bumpy's signal, waiting for permission to protect the man who'd protected them. Every person in that restaurant would die for Bumpy Johnson, not because they had to, because they wanted to. "Now," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I'm going to give you a choice." He picked up the razor, opened it slowly. The blade caught the light from the overhead fixtures, gleaming like a promise. "You can apologize to my wife for using that word in her presence. You can apologize to these people for disrespecting their home. Then you can walk out of here and tell your Uncle Joe that Harlem is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." He paused. "Or you can find out why they call this Bumpy's Kingdom." Sal Bonanno had killed 17 men in his career. He'd broken bones, burned businesses, extorted millions. He'd seen violence that would make most people vomit. He wasn't used to being afraid. But standing there in that restaurant, surrounded by 40 silent witnesses, staring into Bumpy Johnson's cold, calm eyes, Sal Bonanno felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child. Terror. Not the kind of terror that comes from physical pain, the kind that comes from realizing you've miscalculated badly, walked into a trap, and there's no way out that doesn't end with your death. Bumpy smiled. That same smile from earlier, the one that said he'd already written the ending to this story, and it didn't include Sal Bonanno walking out alive unless Bumpy allowed it. Then Bumpy Johnson said 6 words. 6 words that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. 6 words that would be whispered in back rooms and retold in cautionary tales. "Your uncle will bury you tomorrow." The words hung in the air like smoke, like a curse, like a prophecy. Sal's face went pale, actually pale, which was impressive considering how dark the restaurant was. "What?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You heard me," Bumpy said calmly, like he was discussing the weather. "You walked into my restaurant, disrespected me, disrespected my wife, disrespected my people, and you think you're walking out of here?" Sal's bodyguards raised their guns fully now, all 6 of them, all pointed at Bumpy Johnson's chest, his head, his heart. Bumpy didn't even blink. "You can shoot me," Bumpy said conversationally, "and maybe you'll kill me. Maybe all 6 of you firing at once will be enough, but the moment you pull those triggers, 40 people in this room will tear you apart. They'll come at you with forks, knives, plates, their bare hands. And even if you somehow fight your way through all of them, even if you make it out that door, you think you're making it out of Harlem alive?" He gestured toward the window, toward the street outside. "This is my city, Sal. Every block, every corner, every alley, every rooftop. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet. Your soul already understands." The silence was absolute. You could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, someone's breath, shallow and quick, terrified. Sal's hand was shaking, just barely, but it was shaking. The gun wavered in his grip. And that's when Bumpy Johnson did something that proved he was more than just a gangster, more than just muscle and reputation. He showed mercy. "Or," Bumpy said softly, his voice almost gentle now, "you can apologize to my wife. You can apologize for your ignorance and your disrespect. You can walk out of here and never come back. You can tell your Uncle Joe that if he wants Harlem, he can come himself. But he better bring more than 6 men. He better bring an army. And even then, I'll send them home in boxes." For 10 seconds, nobody moved. 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. 10 seconds where every person in that restaurant held their breath and wondered if they were about to witness a massacre. Then Sal Bonanno lowered his weapon. His crew looked at him in shock. These were hardened criminals, men who'd never backed down from a fight, and their boss was surrendering. But Sal wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Mamie Johnson. "Mrs. Johnson," Sal said, his voice barely audible, I apologize. That word, I shouldn't have said it. I disrespected you, and that was wrong." Mamie didn't respond. She just stared at him with those cold, unforgiving eyes that said an apology didn't erase the offense, but it might save his life. Sal backed away slowly, like you back away from a predator. His crew followed him, weapons still out, but lowered now. They moved toward the door like men walking away from a bomb they'd accidentally triggered. When Sal reached the door, he turned back one last time. Pride would let him leave without the last word, even though wisdom screamed at him to shut up and run. "This isn't over, Bumpy," Sal said. Bumpy sat back down, picked up his fork, cut another piece of his steak, which was probably cold by now, but he didn't seem to care. "Yes, it is," Bumpy said, without looking up. "You just don't know it yet." Sal and his crew left. The door swung shut behind them. For a moment, the restaurant stayed silent, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then, someone started clapping. Slow at first, then faster, then everyone was clapping, standing, cheering. Bumpy Johnson had just stared down 6 armed mobsters and walked away without firing a single shot, without spilling a single drop of blood. Mamie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Bumpy replied, his voice tired now. "Respect is everything. You lose that, you lose everything. The moment I let that word stand, the moment I let them walk in here and dictate terms, it's over. Everything we built crumbles." Sal Bonanno left Harlem that night. He never came back. He never even drove through it again. The word on the street was that he told his Uncle Joe what happened, and Joe went ballistic. 3 days later, the 5 families held an emergency meeting in Manhattan. Joe Bonanno wanted revenge. He wanted blood. He wanted Bumpy Johnson's head on a platter. But Frank Costello, the man who really ran New York's underworld, the man whose word carried more weight than anyone else's, said something that changed everything. "Bumpy Johnson runs Harlem because Harlem wants him to. He's not like us. We rule through fear and money. He rules through loyalty and respect. You try to take Harlem by force, you start a war we can't win. Not because we can't kill him, we can, but because we can't kill 40,000 people who'll die for him." He paused. "Leave Harlem alone. Let Bumpy Johnson run his numbers game. We've got Brooklyn, Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens. We don't need Harlem, and trying to take it will cost us more than it's worth." And they listened. From that night forward, the Italian mob never tried to take over Harlem's numbers game again. They made deals with Bumpy. They negotiated. They showed respect, because Bumpy Johnson had taught them something they'd forgotten in their rise to power. Power isn't just about guns and money. It's not about how many soldiers you have or how brutal you can be. Real power is about loyalty. It's about earning the respect of people who don't have to give it to you. It's about building something bigger than yourself, something worth protecting, something worth dying for. Sal the Butcher Bonanno died in 1952. Heart attack. He was only 38 years old. Some people said it was natural, just bad luck and worse genetics. Others said Bumpy Johnson had a long memory, and that razor of his never stayed clean for long. Nobody knows for sure, and that's part of Bumpy's legend. But here's what we do know. After that night in October 1948, nobody ever disrespected Bumpy Johnson in his own restaurant again. Nobody ever walked into Wells' restaurant thinking they could intimidate the godfather of Harlem. And that razor he put on the table that night, he never had to use it in that context again. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon a man has isn't made of steel. It's the love and loyalty of his people. Bumpy Johnson would continue to run Harlem's numbers game until the 1960s, when the Italian mob finally made inroads through different means, not force, but through political corruption and the heroin trade that devastated black communities. But even then, Bumpy remained respected, feared, and loved. He died in 1968, just 7 years before the events of this story became widely known through various books and accounts. He died in that same restaurant, Wells, slumped over in his favorite corner booth. Some say he died how he lived, in control, on his own terms, in his kingdom. The story of Bumpy Johnson and that October night teaches us something important about power and respect. In a world that told him he was nothing, that told him black men couldn't be bosses or leaders or kings, Bumpy Johnson built an empire. Not through violence, though he was capable of it, not through terror, though he could inspire it, but through genuine care for his community. Every hospital bill he paid, every abusive husband he stopped, every kid he saved from jail, these weren't calculated moves for power, they were acts of humanity, but they created something more valuable than any army: loyalty that couldn't be bought or intimidated away. Sal Banana walked into that restaurant with 6 guns, thinking firepower was power. He walked out, understanding that real power is 40 people willing to fight for you, not because they fear you, but because they love you. That's Bumpy Johnson's legacy. That's why his name still echoes through Harlem. That's why his story matters. If this story moved you, if it taught you something about real strength and the power of respect and loyalty, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand that violence isn't power, community is. Drop a comment below. Have you ever seen someone command a room with just their presence and reputation? What's the most powerful display of non-violent strength you've witnessed? And hit that notification bell for more untold stories about the legends who built Harlem with blood, sweat, and unbreakable will. Because these stories matter, these legends matter, and the lessons they teach us about respect, loyalty, and real power, they're more relevant today than ever. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.